Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Trinity University's 2022 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Commemorative Lecture. I'm Danny Anderson, President of Trinity University, and I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. While we're very disappointed that we can't host this event in person like we had planned, we are very excited that we're able to bring this important lecture to you tonight. It's being recorded on the Tiger Network, and it'll be able to be viewed by anyone, anywhere, free of charge at any time. This event is hosted by the Student Diversity and Inclusion Office in partnership with the City of San Antonio's Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. I am deeply grateful for the leadership of Courtney Balderas, the Director of the Student Diversity and Inclusion Office. Tonight's event would not be possible without her leadership. In any other year, San Antonio's Martin Luther King Jr. Commission would help coordinate a march in honor of Dr. King of approximately 300,000 participants, one of the largest rallies of its kind. Many Trinity students, faculty, and staff participate in this rally of unity. However, for the second straight year, the traditional MLK March did not take place because of the pandemic. That does not diminish Dr. King's vision of justice and equality. In fact, his message of unity, inclusion, and understanding is as important today as it has ever been. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, Anneliese Bruner, I want to introduce Dr. Juan Sepulveda. Juan was recently appointed as Trinity's first President's Special Advisor for Inclusive Excellence. His role was envisioned by the President's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, which was formed in 2020 to help Trinity reconcile its past and re-envision its future on topics related to belonging and inclusion. Juan has a proven track record of bringing people together to build consensus and implement strategies that benefit the entire university community. I am excited by what he brings to Trinity. Juan, would you please take over the evening?
Thank you, President Anderson, and thank everybody for joining us here tonight for this incredible event. I'm honored to be serving in this new role at Trinity. The first thing I wanted to do was to kind of once again give a big shout out and a round of applause to my partner, Courtney Balderas, the Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion. This event wouldn't be taking place tonight without her. You're going to get a chance to see her a little bit later tonight, but I just wanted to make sure you got to see up front a big round of applause for Courtney for all that she's doing for us tonight. And I just wanted to kind of take a minute here tonight just to kind of introduce myself to those of you who are part of the Trinity community and the Trinity family. We look forward to working closely with you on this really important work as we kind of create a stronger and more inclusive place of belonging for us here at Trinity. And for those of you who are outside of Trinity, who are in San Antonio, who are in Texas, or even beyond, we're looking forward to partnering with you as Trinity kind of strengthens our relationship with the community beyond our campus. Tonight is going to be an incredible night. We know that so much of the diversity, equity, inclusion work that we do is about relationship building. It's about community building. It's about learning more about each other. It's about learning more about our stories. There's a great quote from one of my favorite authors, Sue Monk Kidd, who wrote The Secret Life of Bees. She said, stories have to be told or they die. And when they die, we can't remember who we are or why we're here. Tonight is one of those nights for us to remember some really important stories. We're glad that you're here with us, and we're glad that you're going to be part of this conversation. What I get to do next is, at this time, I get to introduce Samantha Henry, one of our stars at Trinity, who's majoring in anthropology and minoring in African American studies and history. Her hometown is also Amarillo, Texas. Shout out to Amarillo and to Sam. As is a tradition for this lecture, Sam was selected by Dr. Carrie Lattimore, an associate professor of history at Trinity. Samantha is an active participant at SACAM, the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, which is located at La Villita in downtown San Antonio. One of her key areas of study is oral history, which is going to be a significant part of tonight's conversation. Sam's going to be introducing Ms. Bruner, who's going to be discussing her book and her stories for approximately 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A, a question and answer session moderated by Dr. Lattimore. Ladies and gentlemen, let me turn to Samantha Henry.
Thank you so much, Juan. Good evening to everyone. With great respect and honor, I will be introducing Anneliese M. Bruner. Anneliese M. Bruner is the great-granddaughter of Tulsa Race Massacre survivor and author Mary E. Jones Parrish, whose contemporaneous eyewitness account, The Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, helped preserve the truth of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma from May 31st to June 1st, 1921. She is also a writer and editor who has worked in the business, media, and nonprofit sectors. Her work has appeared in Crisis Magazine, CNN.com, Honey Magazine, Savoy, USAID Frontlines, and The Lily. She attended Bryn Mawr College, and she was born and raised in San Francisco with stints in Oakland and considers California her home. She has lived in Washington, D.C. for more than 35 years. Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish, Bruner's great-grandmother, was born in 1892 in Yazoo City, Mississippi, and she moved to Tulsa around 1919 and worked teaching typing and shorthand at a branch of the YMCA. A trained journalist, Parish gathered eyewitness accounts from the survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. She chronicled her own experience as well, fleeing the violence with her young daughter. Those accounts were published in her book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, which was privately printed in 1923. Trinity University Press published the book for a general audience for the first time as The Nation Must Awake, My Witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 for the 100th anniversary of the massacre. Oral histories and first-person accounts have timeless value, and I purchased this book as soon as it came out, and now I am blessed to have the opportunity to be a part of this event tonight. From the book, I quote, "It should teach us to look up, to lift up, and lend a helping hand, and remember that we cannot rise higher than our weakest brother. Let us come together to remember what has happened this evening, and let us be grateful for the courage and accounts of Mary E. Jones Parrish." With that, it is my pleasure to introduce her great-granddaughter, Anneliese M. Bruner.
Thank you so much, Ms. Henry, for that lovely, lovely introduction. Thank you, President Anderson, Dr. Sepulveda, Dr. Lattimore, and Ms. Baldera. My name, as you've heard, is Anneliese Bruner, and my great-grandmother and grandmother were Mary E. Jones Parrish and her daughter, Florence Mary Parrish, survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Together, they lived through almost 20 hours of burning, looting, unevenly matched fighting, and bloodshed, which happened from May 31st through June 1st. The violence that was perpetrated hinged on the pretext of avenging a societal wrong, wherein a young Black man was falsely accused of assaulting a white teenage girl. Vigilantes gathered at the jail where the young man was being held to exact mob justice for the drummed-up assault charge. A group of Black Tulsans, many of them World War I veterans, organized to defend the young man from being lynched. And the mob responded by unleashing violence upon the young man's community, Greenwood, with a viciousness that was remarkable, even in an age where terror attacks on Black towns and citizens were common. The big lie that the young girl was assaulted, given legs by the Tulsa Tribune, and taken up by the community, gave license to people who were already hell-bent on destruction. The massacre was a manifestation of a cruel ideology that opposed the notion that norms and practices of organized society should function equally for all society's members. We know this because historical evidence exists to suggest that the attack had been organized in advance and was simply awaiting a precipitating event to provide the veneer of legitimacy. The internal workings of the minds of all the mob's members cannot be certain, but we do know that cool, calculating heads had planned the locations for the detention camps, the strategic positioning of the Oklahoma Guard on the perimeter of the Greenwood section to confront residents as they fled, the ensuing city ordinances that hindered rebuilding, and the deployment of weapons of war, planes and machine guns. Looking back on the attack as she wrote her own story and the stories of other survivors, Mary Parish lamented, "Tonight, as I write and think of Tulsa, my eyes well with tears and my soul cries for justice. O America, thou land of the free and home of the brave, the country that gave its choicest blood and bravest hearts to make the world safe for democracy. How long will you let mob violence reign supreme? Is democracy a mockery?" Her peace and security were shattered, and she began to question whether justice would be applied even-handedly and the perpetrators punished in proportion to their crimes. Fast forward 100 years, and we can see that some of the social dynamics of the historical moment in which we find ourselves today were presaged by the crucible of events through which my ancestors lived. We face in our country today an identifiable threat to our notion of democracy, culminating most visibly in the attempted coup d'etat of 1/6 of 2021, when an angry mob with deliberate timing invaded the Capitol of the United States with the intention of stopping the certification of the presidential election of 2020. Some of the calculating heads in this uprising executed their role in the invasion with military precision, which we now know from reading charging documents brought against them by the Department of Justice for seditious conspiracy. And the assault on democratic norms in the form of falsehoods pushed by powerful public and media figures, agitation toward violence, and suppression of factual history is ongoing. As in the case of Tulsa, the history of which was denied and suppressed for far too long, we are faced with a choice: eschew the short-term comfort of denialism and instead face squarely the dangers we face and commit to prioritizing a renewed democracy and rebuilding together, or continue to equivocate about the gravity of the threat to our ideals and risk a ruinous transformation of our political system into something that resembles autocracy rather than democracy. These are the stakes that crystallized in my mind last year as I watched the events of 1/6 unfold. It was Wednesday, my day off work, and I was watching a newsfeed on Twitter. A reporter began excitedly describing and showing the events that were unfolding on the grounds of the Capitol in my hometown, Washington, D.C. A mob was storming the Capitol building itself, breaking through security barriers, scaling the outer walls, busting out windows, battering doors, and combating police. Combating police. I had to process that. Anyone who has read my essay in Mary Parish's book knows that I was followed by police for the first time as a 10th grader in San Francisco, walking to school one morning. I was just a girl, a kid. I knew even then that you don't mess with the police. Yet these people were engaging police in hand-to-hand combat, pepper spraying them, disregarding police orders, snatching their shields, and fearlessly threatening them, even beating some of the officers. Of all the things that were happening around that day, that was the part I could not wrap my mind around, and I was shook. I had no desire to see citizens mowed down by police, but there it was in a way that was not open to interpretation. The mob did not acknowledge the authority of the police nor fear their lethality. My peace and security were shattered, like my great-grandmother's had been. The wheels had come off. I was profoundly agitated and needed to find an outlet for my grief and fear. I reached out to an editor at the Lily, Lena Felton, for whom I had written a piece back in November of 2020. I told her that I wanted to place a story about the Capitol invasion, likening the mob to the one that destroyed Tulsa's Greenwood district 100 years before. I saw the same bloodlust and heard the same drumbeat, and I thought that I was well positioned to do it as a Tulsa descendant residing in Washington, D.C. My story in the Lily drew noted historian, author, and Tulsa native Scott Ellsworth's attention, who connected me with Trinity University Press and their republishing of Mary Parrish's book. I was honored to be included in a volume with Dr. Ellsworth, who wrote the introduction, and esteemed historian Dr. John Hope Franklin, who contributed the foreword posthumously. But truthfully, I was most excited and proud to have my words appear almost 100 years after the events of Tulsa, alongside the words of my intrepid great-grandmother. Several months after the January insurrection, in the run-up to the centennial commemoration scheduled to take place in Tulsa in May of 2021, I was anticipating my first ever trip to the city where my foremothers and other ancestors lived, and where my father grew up. My great-grandmother's book, The Nation Must Awake, was scheduled to be re-released on May 25th, and I was gearing up for the task of presenting her work in the city where she lived, taught, and reported. I admit to being a little nervous about what I would feel once I arrived in town, and even whether I would be welcomed into the community. Despite my heritage, I was, after all, an outsider. In preparation for going, I was on a panel with Dr. Ellsworth, who has heretofore been the most recognized storyteller of the Tulsa narrative. The panel's moderator, Dr. Carrie Lattimore, Trinity's own, asked the important question of why interest in the Tulsa Race Massacre was gaining increased notoriety after almost a century of official suppression, media skepticism, and the disappointed hopes of 3 living survivors and scores of descendants for justice and reparations. I believed that the impending landmark anniversary and the rekindled thirst in our country for racial truth and justice, in the wake especially of George Floyd's killing by police in 2020, were the drivers of a newfound interest in the story of Tulsa. Scott confirmed that my view was partially accurate, yet incomplete. He felt that the Watchmen series on HBO, in which Regina King's character returns to her family roots in Tulsa, played the biggest role. King's character is a massacre descendant. He says, I can't speak more highly of the impact that Watchmen has had. Watchmen has taken this story, obviously a fictionalized version, but it's taken this story around the world. When that first episode came out, he continued, I heard from people in Great Britain and elsewhere. This has brought it to an entire new generation. That interest made this past year the right one for me to participate in bringing forward my great-grandmother's story of survival through the book, which catapulted her contemporaneous reporting back into the public eye after decades of erasure. My father gave me Mary Parrish's original cloth-bound book in 1994, when I was already an adult. And although it was family history, no one in my family ever spoke about it in front of me. Compiled from in-person interviews and eyewitness experience in the aftermath of the massacre, and published soon after, my great-grandmother's book told a story of tragedy and survival. But Mary Parrish's centrality to chronicling the human stories of the disaster and loss did not ensure the survival of her place in history. I took that on as a charge when my father implored me to take the book and see if you can do anything with this, he said. It took many years, but the timing is right today. After the panel discussion with Dr. Ellsworth and Dr. Lattimore, and once I was in Tulsa, I made my way to 103 Greenwood Avenue, the building that stands in the place where my grandmother and great-grandmother had lived. The night of May 31st, 1921, the students to whom my great-grandmother taught secretarial skills at the Mary Parish School of Natural Education had been dismissed for the evening around 9:30 p.m., and the young mother sat down to read. Her little daughter, who had been amusing herself by looking out the window onto Greenwood Avenue, interrupted her with an urgent cry. "Mother, I see men with guns." That moment segued into a series of cascading events that determined their survival and made possible a future where my very existence was possible. Vigilantes, intent on arson, looting, and murder, marauded through their district, setting homes ablaze as they advanced on the community. Mary rushed to the window and saw that what her daughter said was true. There were men in the streets carrying long rifles. She instructed little Florence to lie down on the duofold sofa bed, hoping that it would stop any bullets that might penetrate the windows or walls. During the next hours and through until morning, gunshots and fire tore through the neighborhood. The young mother was in a quandary about how best to save herself and her young daughter. She decided that it would be best to die on the street by gunfire than to remain in her home and be incinerated. Her neighbors had already fled, but she had waited to see if the attack would stop. When mother and daughter came out onto the street, someone yelled, "Get out of the street with that child, or you both will be killed." They fled for their lives amidst drive-by shootings by men with long guns, machine gun fire from the National Guard, and white citizens deputized by the Tulsa police who surrounded the quarter, blazing buildings, and aerial attack. That is the moment in Mary's story that captures every bit of my imagination as I watch the two of them in my mind's eye. It is this more personal, more individual history that inspires me to preserve the truth of Tulsa as my way to pay it forward and do all I can to emphasize how high are the stakes of letting the nation's temperature reach the boiling point. When I consider the rise of militia groups across the country that are increasingly violent in their actions, and as their calls for violence escalate, I hear echoes of Tulsa in my ears. I have written several times about the stark similarities between 1921 Tulsa and the mob violence the country witnessed in the January coup attempt. That attack was at the institutional level, but the calls I hear now promoting a so-called second civil war sound ominous at the personal level. I hear the same calls that led a white mob of thousands to target and kill Black people in the places where they worked and lived. And because their number was not sufficient to fend off the invaders indefinitely, their community was overrun. Black people constitute roughly 13% of the United States population and are in no position to defend against a race war that some provocateurs say they want to see happen. That would not be a war, it would be a massacre, a point that lives at the forefront of my mind. There is no such thing as a race war in this country. Violent extremists are truly invoking a massacre by their very use of that terminology. Black people are not a practical threat to white Americans and have never been. Hysterical reporting aside, I will say it again. A desire for a massacre is what's being invoked by these bloodthirsty rantings. In fact, a mere 11 months before he was assassinated, Dr. King himself, in a wide-ranging interview with reporter Sander Van Coor, explained that Black people do not have the means to engage in any high-level conflict with any powerful forces in this nation. It's an absurd consideration. So at this moment of reckoning in our country, as we struggle to recover and heal from the trauma of a global pandemic exacerbated by a careless administration and its effect on our national psyche, we must recognize that the threat to our ideals persists and understand what that means for us all. A not insignificant cadre of Americans wants to create a unified but sanitized narrative of our country's history using media, civil society, and academia. This narrative seeks to promote a worldview in which America reflects a singular, innocent identity, a worldview in which those who have a different experience do not deserve to be heard. They are labeled unpatriotic, non-credible, and unworthy of belonging. The collective amnesia, like that enforced in Tulsa for years, that is required to create space for the unified narrative, is being force-fed to us now. Some state legislatures want to outlaw the teaching of curricula that are cynically labeled controversial, a psychic threat to the predominant group, or insufficiently patriotic. A reactionary entity called the 1776 Commission was established by the previous federal administration to promote so-called patriotic education, and local school boards across the country are being targeted for takeover by reactionary candidates. A high school English teacher at Edmond Memorial High School in Oklahoma, Reagan Kalaki, claims that school officials instructed us to avoid books by authors of color and women authors. He calls the legislation behind that instruction a censorship bill. Putting such rules into practice would silence Mary Parrish's voice and demonstrate her irrelevance to a greater America. In her book, Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence, from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, psychiatrist Judith Lewis Herman says that secrecy and silencing are used to promote forgetting. This is what happened in Tulsa from the immediate aftermath of the massacre forward. The victims were silenced, many fearing that the same thing could happen again. Accounts of the event were scrubbed from local records and newspapers, and people who sought to investigate and find out the truth, even decades later, both Black and white, were threatened with death and loss of livelihood. When Mother Viola Fletcher, the oldest living survivor at 107, testified before Congress this past May about her experience of the massacre, she said that even the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce denied that the catastrophe had happened. With the reemergence of The Nation Must Awake, doubt about what happened is permanently discredited. In her own words, Mary Parish compiled a contemporaneous evidentiary record without parallel. Her book is a primary source for subsequent scholarship about the massacre because of the level of detail she provides. In our time, we are charged with combating the forgetting that would permit simplistic, manipulative narratives to define who we are as a society. In a recent New York Times article that a friend, Karen Chenoweth, sent me, Tim Snyder, the Levin Professor of History at Yale, claims that a war on history is a war on democracy. I believe this to be true. What he calls memory laws are taking hold as we watch legislation rise to prohibit the teaching of a more complete and accurate accounting of our nation's history. Inflammatory rhetoric is being deployed against white Americans to make them feel that cultural erasure is on the horizon. And the words of Dr. King himself are being twisted for use as a cudgel against folks who are working to continue his work, fighting for one person, one vote, the truest manifestation of democracy. If hysteria and knee-jerk reaction become the norm around the mere utterance of catchphrases like critical race theory or caravans, truth will be the first casualty, and other cherished values will fall from there. Stories like my great-grandmother's are a foil to this growing denialism, and we must take the mature view of history, which can only strengthen our communities and our nation. In The Tempest, Antonio says, whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. Often interpreted to mean that history will repeat itself, the quote suggests instead that the future is within our power to shape. We must not squander the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bruner, for those powerful words. We're going to transition now to the question and answer portion with Dr. Carrie Lattimore, Associate Professor of History. Dr. Lattimore.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and President Anderson and everyone else who is here. It is a pleasure to be here and to commemorate the publication of Trinity University's publication of this book, The Nation Must Awake. And I should say that my copy of the book is well read, but it looks like Samantha's was much more read, because it looked, she had it, it was pretty well read, and I could see that. There's a lot of questions that I have for Ms. Bruner, and so many things that I would like to unpack. But I think the first question that I would like to address is, we know so little about Mary Jones Parrish. And I went online trying to find a little bit of information about her, and it's just not really there. And that says something in and of itself, as the washing of history of Black and Brown and Asian and minorities. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what we know about Ms. Parrish, but also what that kind of says about us as a nation, that someone who had so much to contribute, we know so little about. So I'd like to hear what Ms. Bruner has to say about that.
I know some about my great-grandmother, but she was not discussed within my family for some reason. As I said, I grew up in San Francisco. Washington is now what I consider my hometown, but I had never been to Oklahoma before last year, celebrating the publication of the book. She was born in Yazoo City, Mississippi. I do know that she was in a training program in Rochester, New York, as a court reporter, stenographer, and office skills were also a part of what she learned there and took to Tulsa and was teaching. She had not only her job at the YMCA, but she was also the head of her own personal school that she ran on her own independently within the rooms that she rented in the Woods building there on Greenwood Avenue. She later became a professor at Langston University. And after that, for me, there isn't a lot that I know, despite having tried to do a little bit more research. But all of that, to get to your question, I think that for me, when I think about Mary Jones Parrish, I think it's a matter, I can't help but see that she, as a woman, has been erased. We do know some things about some of the other people who were instrumental in building up the Greenwood District. They have been remembered. We have their words, we have accolades for them, but for this person who wrote such a pivotal piece of work, a pivotal piece of evidence, we don't see a lot of recognition so far. And what stands out for me is her gender.
Yes, excellent. And that's something that we, have seen throughout history, the washing away of our storytellers. Even in the civil rights movement, many of the women, the Black women who were so instrumental to the movement, we know little about, and their contributions have been almost forgotten to history in regards to the quote, the men of history. And even some of the Black men have been forgotten. But truly the Black women have often, their stories have not been told. And that's just a true travesty. And I looked online to try to find any information that I could, and I could find so little about such a remarkable woman. And it just really is a shame, to be honest, that we know so little about this remarkable woman. I should have mentioned at the beginning that please, if you have questions for Ms. Bruner, submit them to the chat on the Tiger Network, and we will try to get to them. I have a couple of other questions as we try to get to some other questions. And there's something that you mentioned in your afterward, and it struck me as we think about Martin Luther King and we celebrate the holiday, and we think about the ties between, in African American history of the past, the present, and perhaps looking at the future. And you write this: the elements that contributed to the disaster, the view of Black equality as anathema to the natural social order, official complicity in mob violence, and weaponization of legislation in service to moneyed interests still animate the American landscape we inhabit today. Here was a well-to-do community where people were living up to expectations of the larger society. And I think about, what Martin Luther King fought and what he struggled for. And I'd like for you to tie these things together and to kind of think about how it all fits, in a sense, together. And when we think about and we celebrate Martin Luther King, we still have these ties that seem to be almost woven together so tightly, knit so tightly. And I'd just like to hear you respond to that and what ties that past to the present and probably scaringly to the future.
I think that we forget, when I was talking about what Tim Snyder says about memory laws, it's not just a matter of laws. People forget very quickly. And we, as human beings, we simply don't take seriously the moment that we're in as being a part of history. We're just living in the moment, and we forget that we, the younger people have to ask the older people, and the older people have to volunteer. In my very own family, there's a breakdown. I've described it here of the continuity is just not there. All of us have very important stories, very important interpretations of the day-to-day living, looking at what's happening. I mean, that is why when I watched what happened on 1/6, it immediately took me back to Tulsa because I already have the knowledge about Tulsa. Had I not had that information already, it would have just been, wow, this is something new. That it was something new in terms of the way it was actually executed, but it wasn't something new, as I said in my essay, in terms of the sentiment that animates people to this type of behavior, this type of violence and this type of disregard for the larger social norms that we adhere to and that give us order, that give us purpose and order. So I think that, one of the failures that I've seen that contribute to this kind of fraction, this kind of fractured way that we look at history, it's just a lack of stories, a lack of continuity, a lack of broader perspective. We tend to engage in parochialism. We look at the same things over and over again, and we don't look at and listen to the stories of others. And I think that that's why, it's so dangerous to try to have a forced curriculum of a very narrow nature to teach in teaching children history. And there are uncomfortable things about it, of course, but I think that there are professionals that are fully capable of creating narratives, weaving them together, and helping people understand the meanings of these things, so that as we see new challenges in society arise, we're able to not just deal with them, we're able at a basic level to comprehend them. Because I think that what happened on 1/6 was incomprehensible for a lot of people, absolutely incomprehensible and terrifying. And living here in Washington, I don't know if people around the country can understand how frightening it was. It was terrifying. We were under curfew, it was, for me, it was a flashback to Tulsa and what it must have been like to be in your home and not know what was going on a lesser level in the neighborhoods here, but to be in your home and hear all of these reports and not know what was driving this, when it was going to end. Were you going to be safe in your home? Should you try to flee? These kinds of things that are described in the book for their time and their lives. But nevertheless, I think it's important to draw the connections. I think it's important to know the history so that you can draw the connections and know what all of this means.
I really like the way that you talked about the silence of it, because silence comes in from both sides in a sense for different reasons. But the ultimate consequence of that silence is that we don't get to hear the full breadth of the story. And so one perspective is generally presented. And so from Tulsa is part of a larger narrative from Nat Turner to the Reconstruction violence, Colfax riot, or what I would call the Colfax Massacre, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, Wilmington, Greenwood, all of these stories have the same, or even the civil rights movement and how we've kind of sanitized the deaths and the seriousness and the dog bites and the hoses of the civil rights movement up until January 6th, where there's now a movement almost sanitize that and say that it's not really that bad. And so all of these things seem to tie it together of, I don't want to say the word a conspiracy of silence, but it almost works that way. But can you speak a little bit about silence for the African American? What do you think about that? Because that's certainly an aspect to it, is our not complicit silence, but our silence as perhaps protection against ourselves to protect our psychology, our emotional state, or to protect our own interests. So can you talk a little bit about African American silence in the state of these situations?
Well, I think that there's an enforced silence, but there's also a self-imposed silence, much as you have described. There's something from the outside and something from the inside, but I think they all, and I hate to use that word too, but I think those things work together. They conspire almost to help you cope and to continue putting one foot in front of the other. Those people who lived in Greenwood survived the massacre and were still in the area, within the next whatever time frame, those people still had to go to work every day. They still had to, earn money and things of this nature. And so there is sometimes just a blunting of your own psychological trauma. You self-censor to be able to go on. You don't want to think about it. And perhaps, someone who has dished out abuse onto someone doesn't want you to talk about it or think about it or to, challenge their notion of themselves. And so I think that definitely it's an element that's at play, but we also have to know that it's something that we have to work against, because silence is nullification, and the nullification of the human, the nullification of the individual is, leads to this kind of, I think, this kind of dehumanization that makes all kinds of atrocities possible, makes them possible and acceptable, which is, I think, not someplace that we want to go.
Exactly. In many ways, your great-grandmother's work is like, Ida B. Wells, and the connections are just so strong and the ties that she builds. And one of the things that Ida Wells does is to educate Americans about the realities of lynching, and that she really presents lynching not as Black men attacking white women, but as an attack of white people against Black, progress. And that's really Greenwood in essence. Can you talk a little bit about what Greenwood meant to African Americans who were living there, and why the realities of Greenwood probably contributed, well, not probably, did contribute to what happened with Greenwood? Because the reality is, we think that, it was Dick Rowland, but that really wasn't the issue here, was it?
No. Dr. Julianne Malveaux calls it, she labels it economic envy. It's something where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, because you are accused of being lazy and shiftless, unambitious, and these kinds of things, when you may not work or have the opportunity to work, but then you're only supposed to rise so high. If you're doing too well as a minority member of a broader community, it brings attention to you that can be very destructive. And so there were words that were circulating around during the massacre itself that were overheard about, the people in here in this community living better than other people in the broader community in Tulsa, and that was suspected, and probably true, suspected of being one of the main drivers that precipitated the massacre itself, but not only from the perspective of what was really what was given, the story that was given, the pretext, but also because there were those underlying factors that were always present, and so it just needed a match to light the spark.
And this match is very similar to other matches in the Atlanta, race riots and others. We see the media or the news media using this is a match to incite, but the underpinnings of it is really Black progress and Black sustainability, which is an anathema to the idea of what America is at that point in time. And so thank you so much for exploring that issue. We have a question from a Trinity student, and it's a really good question from Austin Klein. Could you discuss the role that Tulsa police played in not only failing to prevent the Tulsa massacre, but served to aid in its facilitation? How do United States police serve to enable white supremacy even today?
Well, I think that it's well known that in kind of, we are not an authoritarian state, but there are certain aspects of life that certain people live that could be likened to what the broader population might experience under an authoritarian regime. And one of those elements is the alignment of the state in the form of the police, having a close relationship with vigilante members of the broader community. And that's something that we absolutely saw here. We saw some elements of it in the 1/6 event, where there were some police who were perceived as being friendly, but I think in the more recent incident, it absolutely held that there was one side, which were the police, and the other side, which were those who were breaking the law. In the Tulsa incident, over 100 years ago now, there was an alignment between the lawbreakers and those who were supposed to uphold the law. And I think that, it's a bit more complicated now, but at that time, we do know that law enforcement often participated. We know Bull Connor, these kinds of people participated in the struggle against civil rights, against Black progress. And so we are not in that same state, of course, but elements of that do still appear, obviously.
There are a couple of questions also on the board here now that speak about, January 6th again, and making the tie between Tulsa and January 6th. And what are some of the lessons, hopefully, that we learn from the mistakes of January, of Tulsa and the sanitation and how that was sanitized? And when I say sanitized, there were, we know now that there were airplanes that were dropping bombs. That was for many years told to be a lie. Now we know that to be true. The numbers of people that died, it was underestimated. How can we better tell the story of January 6th? Because we have an opportunity to do that now. We kind of muffed it, for lack of a better word, after Tulsa, except for your great grandmother. But what are some of the lessons from Tulsa for January 6th?
I think that transgressions of that magnitude cannot go unpunished, because when you are determined to punish criminal activity and wrongdoing at that scale, you have legal documentation. We have, the Department of Justice has charging documents, and those are official records of investigations that have been carried out and persons who are being slated for indictment and prosecution at some point. The Tulsa situation, I think, was such a mess for many reasons, but at that time there was no justice. There was, a lot of equivocating about who was responsible, what really happened, and those kinds of things. And so the righteous cause of people who were seeking justice was denied. And I think that contributes to the mindset of that. At some point, you can sweep it under the rug, you can hide it, you can deny it, you can even tell people to their face that that's not what they experienced.
Yeah, I think we may have lost Ms. Bruner. Are you back there? Are you back?
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, I think I lost you for a few moments.
Oh my, okay.
But I don't know where everybody else, so we'll keep going. When you went back to Tulsa, it had to be an amazing experience in so many ways. There's a question here about what were your feelings? And I know you explored them a little bit, but we want to hear a little bit more about your feelings, but also is there any talk in Tulsa, or did you hear any of how your great-grandmother's work was received? And are you hearing more about what she contributed now since the book was republished?
Well, it was a privately published volume, but there were monies gathered from around the community for this effort. I think that they absolutely understood that the residents of Greenwood absolutely understood how important it was that they told their own story, and that they were responsible for putting together, finding someone who would put together this volume and preserve this history so that the world could not forget. It could not be swept under the rug. It could not be denied, because, as we know, contemporaneous accounts are very powerful, and they are difficult to refute. And so at the time, I think that it was a community effort. She happened to be the person who had the capacity to carry it out. She had the organizational skills. She had the writing skills. She had the skills to transcribe people's reporting of their own experience. So, obviously she was a natural person to do that, but I think that absolutely it was something that the community relied on her to do. I think that they understood how important it was, and how important that it was done by someone who had a high capacity to do it. I felt very proud when I went to Tulsa. It was very interesting to me because I had only heard, stories from my father about his paternal grandmother. I do know more about them, but this side of the family, I had no knowledge of. I did find some of my relatives there who knew my grandmother Florence, who was the little girl in the story. She was 7 years old at the time of the massacre, but they lost touch and track of her as well. So it is a story of a fractured family, and I felt deeply melancholy about that.
Did you find that the community now is more receptive? How do you feel at the community in Tulsa and across the United States? What are you hearing about them speaking about your great grandmother?
Well, I I can't speak for other people. I don't know how people feel about all of this attention, all of the people who kind of descended on Tulsa last year. I don't know if they feel that they were highlighted for a moment and then abandoned. I don't, I can't speak on that. I do know that there is an organization that is seeking a recompense, and particularly for the 3 living survivors who remain. And they're doing good work, and they are, in need of support, obviously. But I think that, there's a core down there who continue to be active, and those are the folks that really, can speak about this issue more so. I don't really feel like I have the authority to do that. I feel that the work speaks for itself, and beyond that, I don't have any authority to say anything about it.
And I would definitely,
but it's been well received, wherever I've gone.
and I would definitely second it. I've read the work more than once, and it's an amazing work. The people that she interviews, diverse group of people, and the stories just, you can feel the tug in what she's bringing. And it's a very raw book, and you can feel her rawness in what she's putting together. You can think about what she must be feeling in
Absolutely.
dictating, but also writing her own story. And that's a, as a writer myself, and I'm sure you'll agree, when you're telling somebody else's story, it's one thing, but then when you tie that to your own and it's your experiences, it must have been a difficult writing to do. And so I think about what she would have had to have endured.
I would imagine. She does say in the book, I'm sure you've seen, focusing on the problems of others helped her forget her own. But, to watch something like that, to know that you're fleeing with your young child.
Yes.
And for me, when I read the part in the book where they step out onto the street, possibly to be killed, that's when I say, at that moment, my existence hangs in the balance, because without their survival, I don't exist.
I have the last question, and this is not about Miss Parish, but it's about you. And, I know that your great grandmother has to be smiling down on you for what you've done and how you're contributing and adding to her legacy. But what's next for you? What would you like to see next? Where do you go from here?
Well, I do have some plans to try to follow her footsteps. I don't mean as a writer, but I mean, I do want to go to some of the places that I know she inhabited during her life, and to get a sense of, what their history is, what it was, what it might have been like. I can't obviously capture that, but just as I walked in her footsteps in Tulsa, I would like to be able to do that in some of the other places that I know she lived. I would like to absolutely reach out to Langston University and have her listed as one of their distinguished associates and things of that nature. So it really does continue, and the work continues, and I am absolutely keen on making sure that her voice is not silenced again.
I just wanted to thank you and to encourage everyone who's here to get a copy of the book, The Nation Must Await, Trinity University Press. You will be filled, and it will be a challenging read, but I encourage you, if you have an interest in American history, real American history, oral history, it's a read that you really must go through, because it really tells a story of America that has been hidden for so long, and now it's coming out, and this book does a wonderful job in doing so. And so, on behalf of Trinity University, for me, I just wanted to extend my appreciation for you for coming here and for continuing your great grandmother's legacy. At this point, I'm going to now turn it over to Courtney, and then we will go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Levin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful to you, Ms. Bruner, for joining us this evening. And to echo the sentiments from earlier, we're so looking forward to seeing you in person in the nearest future possible. Fourth time will bring us fortune. I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to President Anderson for his ongoing support and dedication to advancing inclusive excellence at Trinity University. I'd also like to express my immense joy for the partnership of Juan Sepulveda in his new role. And thank you so much to Dr. Lattimore and Ms. Henry for helping us to open this beautiful program. It cannot go unsaid either. Thank you to Trinity Strategic Marketing and Communications team. You all are helping us make things possible in this virtual environment. So thank you. And this event really would not have been possible without the partnership of TU Press, SACAM, and the City of San Antonio MLK Commission. I'm going to allow them to put up the slide next so that our attendees can find out where to purchase a copy of The Nation Must Awake. I don't have my I had my copy here on my desk earlier, but it's not with me. The slide will have a much more beautiful visual of the cover. But thank you all for joining us this evening for the 2022 MLK Commemorative Lecture. I want to wish you all a safe and warm evening. Again, thank you, Ms. Bruner. Outstanding.
Thank you, Ms. Balderas.